The notation implies the performance. Welcome back to Composition and its Allies. My name is Barney. I'm a classical composer, and this is a channel for composers as well as performers that are interested in composition. Fugue for composers is for anyone who wants to compose and finish their first fugue. When it comes to fugue, there are two big blocks to prevent composers from realizing their destiny. We have mental blocks and technical blocks. We'll start with technical blocks. When it comes to fugue, you have to be able to modulate. For example, you may have a fugue subject that you really love that goes from A minor to E minor, and then obviously for the response, you'd probably go from E minor back to A minor. Then this same chemin, as they say in French, or this pathway, will be followed when you go to all the other keys of your fugue. So if that is difficult for you to manage both, here as well as in the fingers, when you're crafting your fugue, then you're going to have a lot of difficulty with your own fugue. Now, we also have to talk about the propaganda. So in many fugue schools I've encountered, it could be the teacher, but sometimes as a student, there's a prize, student who knows the most about Bach and may kind of send doubt in your head. But when you're composing a fugue, you are in charge, you're the master, it is your piece, all right? Unfortunately, when it comes to fugue, for some reason, we think we're in a stranger's house, we're in Bach's house, I guess, home, and we have to follow their rules. That is not at all the case. Composition is following your own rules, but really it's just hearing what you want, and later we create the rules and such not. So in today's episode, I'm going to talk about composing a fugue subject that you love and not what might get your teacher's approval. Let's begin. Let's talk about the subject itself. So on the screen here is the first draft version of the subject for my first fugue, Le Visage odieux for men's chorus. It's from Phèdre, which is a classic French histoire or story, which I am making into an oratorio. So the first version, Et ne lui montre point un visage odieux, right? So I have the notes and the rhythm that I want, but notice that I don't have a key signature or a time signature yet. I'm sure you have different ways of composing. I'm not trying to impose this as the way to do it. I'm just showing you how I went about getting my fugue subject, and it's particularly a fugue subject that I actually love. So in the second version, notice I settled on a key signature, in this case, E flat major. That was pretty much a no-brainer. I kind of already knew at this point, but it's not always obvious. For example, I have another fugue subject from this same oratorio, maybe I'll present in a future episode, where there's a modulation in it, but it wasn't completely obvious at first, and I had to do some analysis. So take the time to just make sure you have the right key signature, because that's going to impact what keys you go on to later in your piece. Now I have the correct key signature, I want to start getting the bar lines. For me, the use of bars and beamings is really important to get the natural accents. In particular, this is a fugue in French, so I want the language to kind of speak, and I will not hesitate to change time signature. It is my fugue, it is my right to do so. So notice I get the most important part, so I have that pickup, no, okay, going across the bar line, which makes perfect sense. And then I have that lyrical ending, visage odieux, okay, that I've kind of separated. So I'm just petit à petit, as they say in French, little by little, just getting the correct form, shall we say, of this subject. Next, I isolated those three eighth notes because I felt, okay, that is a kind of micro idea amongst them. So now notice I have the natural accents of my fugue. So I have a 2-4 to a 3-8 to a 6-8. So I've asked myself, is there a simpler way to represent this? Now, certainly 4-4 is the simplest time signature, but these ideas cannot be expressed in 4-4. This is a fugue subject that I love, and I'm looking for the best way to express it. So notice I settled on a simpler notation. I have that pickup, and then we have a 2-4, and I combine that 3 and a 6-8 into a 9-8. This still allows me to have those natural accents built in, but it'll be just a little bit easier for the conductor and the performers. Keep in mind when you do have time signature changes, obviously that can be difficult for the musician, but come on, it is not that difficult. And you have to compose, if you have to get it right, and you have to do something that you love. You cannot make a compromise this early on. Otherwise, what's going to happen, you're not going to finish the fugue because it's not your fugue. Now I just want to say that this is how I proceed with my fugues. I've completed 2 fugues, and I have a couple other fugues that I've started. You may have seen one for Paradise Lost, and consistently I see that this is how I do it. I consistently proceed in this manner. I don't know if it has to be this way. It's just something to observe and see if you want to take it. What I do want to say is that this is the easy part. Okay, it really should not take that long to get a fugue subject that you love, okay, or to codify it, because the hardest part of a fugue is the management of keys. What keys are you going to go to, all the crazy stuff you want to do, the counterpoint, that's the cool part, but that's going to take a lot of time. Many, many months, if not years in certain cases. So you cannot spend too much time on the subject. What I personally recommend is it should not take more than 3 hours. Okay, if you have one full session of 3 hours, or maybe two separate sessions of an hour and a half, it really should not take that long to just get the fugue subject that you love. All right, so now I want to plan out the entrances. So I want to figure out which voice is going to start off with the subject, what key I'm going to go to for the response, and likewise. So one thing to remind everyone is that in Fugue, the general aesthetic is that we have adjacent voices for the exposition. So for example, if you have a string quartet, Fugue is a string quartet, and you have, let's say the subject starts in the viola, then if you're going up, you go to the violin 2 and then the violin 1, and when you cannot go any further, then you would enter with the cello, which can be a nice effect, right, to deprive the listener of the bass. Or you can go the other direction, so you start with the violin 2 maybe, then you do the viola, then you do the cello, you wait some time maybe, or depends, you can't always wait that much time, but then you bring the violin 1. So, but the principle is adjacent voicings. It is very satisfying for the listener. Of course, you do not have to follow this. You have to listen to what you want in your own fugue. There's no reason you can't do that. But in general, it is pretty customary for the exposition to follow adjacent voicing, and it is a nice effect. The big question is, are you going up or going down? That's the first thing you have to figure out. So I have the first entrance. I placed it with the baritone 1. And notice that for the second entrance, I put it in the dominant, and I have the tenor. Now, one thing to mention is that for your response, you do not have to go to the dominant. When we go to fugue school and we learn the proper way to do a fugue, right, we always go to the dominant for the response. But this is because the golden era of the fugue, let's say it's Bach, that was the language of that time, the harmony, we move to the dominant. So it's important when you're studying fugue to know what is like the style of that period and what is actually fugue. Notice for the third entrance, which is going to go back, it's a tonic, usually. I can't really use it because notice it goes way too high. That's way too high for an opening. The B flat is way too high. Later in the fugue, I do have it for a climax, but you can't compromise that early, so you can't use it. So what this probably means is this is a 3-voice fugue. What I find with fugues is that though I may want it to be a four-voice fugue, which, spoiler alert, I found a way to make this a 4-voice fugue, but in general, like the limitations of the subject and what it imposes, like it travels an octave distance or a little bit larger, you cannot force it to be something that it can't be. Now let's look at the baritone. That opening F is way too low for an opening of a fugue. Now, when it comes to baritone, occasionally they can get to a low F, but it's got to be really at the end of the piece or like slow stepwise motion. You cannot start a fugue with a compromise like that. That's just bad composition. So the rest of it looks good. So the first thing I'm thinking is maybe I can do a key change. I generally find, especially for my vocal fugues, that that's one of the first considerations I have is could I be placed slightly higher or lower so that this fugue is going to work better over time. This is really important when it comes to a fugue and your subject. You have to figure out what's pure and what can be adapted. So obviously the melody and the spirit of it, but maybe it's not in the best key. So next I'm looking at the extremes. So I take the highest voice, which is the tenor 2, and lowest voice, the baritone 2, and just have the parts that might be controversial. So notice I can see the highest note as well as the lowest note. So I search a new key, and the first thing I do is I push it up a third. So we go to G major, and it looks good. Then I try a different key, higher, but not quite as high. I go up a second. All right, and that still works really well. Now the low G is a little controversial, but it is something reasonable when you have a fugue, especially a vocal fugue. You'll see Bach and Handel, they'll have that at times they do go to a low G. So I would say this is a success. One thing to notice is that the tenor 2, which is the second entrance, and then that low baritone, which is the third entrance, they come in the response, which is the dominant, but these are adjacent entrances. So if you look at the fugues by Bach, Not that I need Bach's approval, but if you look, for example, usually it's after the exposition, he will have a subject and then response, or response, subject and response. It's not pure in that sense. And of course, this is a fugue in your own style, and you have to see what's going to work. Now, I want to do is I want to write out all the entrances. I highly recommend handwritten because it's just, you want this quality. You just want that quality, and the computer makes things quicker, but you don't get the experience of seeing for yourself. But do as you like. So I want to verify all these entrances are going to work in the new key. I want to make sure there's no unforeseen consequences. Then I have the tenor. And I have the bass. And nothing unforeseen came up, so success. Now I want to give you some quick fugue tips. Maybe some of them are obvious to you, or maybe they're not, just to help you if you're struggling a little bit. But as a reminder, I'm not your teacher. I cannot teach you how to compose a fugue. You have to make it happen. You have to make it happen. No one is going to help you get a fugue. You have to do it yourself. You have to do the work. There is a lot of struggle. It can be really painful, but you can do it. You have the will. You can make it happen. So first thing is, notice the harmonic implications of your fugue subject. So we have an opening force, a no, okay, across the bar line. Probably heavily implies a dominant tonic relationship. This will persist as you go to different keys of your fugue, but maybe you will not harmonize it in that manner. That's part of the joy sometimes of the fugue, is the different ways that you harmonize a fugue. The French really love that, taking a melody and harmonizing in different ways. Also notice the second part, point of view. So we have a falling fifth within the beat. How are you going to harmonize that? Is that a 6/4 chord in the classical style? There's a danger, or maybe you'll find a way. So the important point is, there may be difficulties in your subject, but you have a fugue subject that you love. So part of the excitement of the fugue is the puzzle, is how you negotiate these things. Let's talk about destroying the beauty of your subject. So you may present a fugue subject to your teacher, and they will sanitize the fugue. So they'll take away all the excitement from the fugue, they'll make it very proper and safe, and they'll take away all the edges. And then you'll have a fugue subject that is not yours, and then of course it's no wonder that you can't finish a fugue because you're not excited about this fugue that is not yours. So to show you an example, in this fugue subject, we talked about the time signature changes. Now, this is consistent with my style. I often have time signature changes because I'm really focused about those natural accents, especially for a fugue for singers. It has to be there. And that is a legitimate decision that you as the composer are allowed to make. That is your right, okay? You are the master, you're the decider. If it needs to change time signature, it has to do that. And you're doing that, of course, because not just for giggles, but because the notation implies the performance. But if you present it to someone, they may say, oh, you can't do that. And so here is an example of a sanitized version of my fugue subject. Et ne lui montre point un visage odieux. All right, so it's safe, it's in 4/4, so there's going to be less difficulty. And I definitely remember when I was in fugue school, taking a subject, even if it's in style Bach, and then trying to compress it or figure out what's going to be difficult about it and make it simpler and cut off all the edges. But of course, then you don't have something that's interesting, and you don't have the motivation to see it to completion. That's all I wanted to share with you today. So if you have not composed your fugue today, please shut off YouTube right now and get to work. If you already composed your fugue today, congratulations. You can watch some other videos that we have on this channel. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good day.